In this episode of the Caustic Rebel podcast,
historians kind of disagree about whether the 1876 election was the only path to the end of Reconstruction. But 1876 definitely was the catalyst as it really played out. And what's the lesson for modern elections? Well, the country sailed on. I think that if you said, boy, that doesn't sound very good, and I'm not happy with the end of Reconstruction, that's something to lament. But it took a long time before we really saw something like equal voting rights again in the South. So I don't want to minimize the importance of that. But the country got through it. It wasn't, just after a horrible, bloody civil war, this didn't kick off a new civil war. It kicked off a lot of unhappiness, but the country kept going. And then the story of 1960, Illinois alone wasn't going to give him the race. You needed Missouri before he would have won it. There was a lot of speculation that Texas was stolen, that Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's running mate, had made sure Texas was stolen, but there was very little evidence to point to that. In the end, the Republicans didn't really have a case to make, with 3 states having to flip. So Nixon conceded. Privately, he said Kennedy had stolen it, but mostly he said they'd stolen Illinois, and probably was right, but it's hard to prove that. And in some respects, the Electoral College sort of insulates from, even if it was stolen, it wasn't sufficient to change the result.
If the 2024 election ends up being on this list as a contested election, what is the most likely mechanism by which that plays out?
I'm hoping whoever wins, it's not by one state. If it's a case where either Trump or Harris could have won, but you have to flip 2 or 3 states, then maybe it won't be as acrimonious, and there won't be as much of a sense that the election was stolen.
Hello, and welcome to the Caustic Rebel podcast. I'm Peter O'Shea, coming to you from Vancouver, Canada.
Yeah, and I'm Tom Quinn from, at the moment, Thun, Switzerland. And we have a special guest today, Dr. Brian Gaines, professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And we know Brian from way back. We attended a geek camp together back in 1984.
There you go, Tom. Most importantly, Brian was an alum of the 1-month program Canadian high school students could attend in 1984. It was a Shad Valley program run by the Canadian Centre for Creative Technology. There's Brian back in 1984. And this full disclosure, this is where we all met. That would be Tom, myself, and Brian, and that was 40 years ago. And yes, for those that don't know Canada, we're all from Canada. And
we only have one viewer, PJ. It's like
here, my little. We at the time represented the 3 prairie provinces. Tom, Alberta, me, Saskatchewan, and I think you were in Manitoba at the time. Is that right, Brian?
I was, yes. So you're right. We covered the prairies. I'm a military brat, so I'm not actually from Manitoba. I'm from hither and yon. I've spent time in Eastern Canada, Western Canada, the United States, and Europe. So I have a little bit of a mongrel's accent, but I think people will hear the Canadian.
With Brian, sorry, Tom.
I have an important thing to point out. Brian introduced me to the Golden Calgarians, who play the theme song at the intro of this podcast.
That was the awesome rocking song that
exactly. I lifted that from with Brian's assistance. So he's the one who got me oriented towards the Golden Calgarian.
Awesome.
Met them when I was a DJ at the University of Winnipeg radio station 40 years ago, and I'm no longer a DJ. I didn't stay with that career.
Did you meet those guys? Did you actually interview them?
Yeah, I met. I can't tell you which ones. They were in town doing a show, and they brought us the record, and I met some.
Oh, nice. This is way more interesting. I thought he just recommended it, but you actually have a history.
We're going to spend the next 40 minutes talking about the career of the Golden Calgarians. No, in fact, that's doing politics.
Why not?
We're Canadians, and apparently we're going to wade into an in-depth discussion of the American political system.
Well, specifically the upcoming election, no?
The version of the talk I believe we're going to see is a review of some of the more content. What was the adjective you used, Brian? The elections that were
difficult. The presidential elections that were difficult to resolve. They were close. They were controversial. That was not a straightforward matter of counting the votes, declaring the winner, and going home.
Okay. So at this point, do you have slides, Brian? Do you want to share those?
I do. I wasn't gonna. I think I'll share them rather selectively. I'll just start in by saying, as we're recording, it's about 2 weeks from the 2024 election. It looks tied in the polls, but there are reasons to be doubtful about polls. But we don't really know who's going to win. So, is 2024 going to be part of this in the future? I'm going to be talking about difficult resolutions, and maybe 2024 will be one of them.
Are you able to consume maybe some of the tension or worry better or worse than somebody that doesn't know the details?
No, I think I'm more relaxed because of I think once you know the history, you think the country's made it through a lot of messes. And when I'm often a naysayer when people say, we've never seen a country so polarized, I say, oh, we certainly have. And I just tell stories about the 1860s and the 1850s.
I want to believe, Grandpa Brian said it's going to be okay, kind of thing. I mean, I'm not down there, but I'm still sort of holding my breath.
I'll talk about 1876 probably next.
Okay, yeah.
1876 is
in
literally
a
a bloody mess. There are lots of violence. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So
now you're scaring me. This is the bedtime story that the scary part.
Yeah, but again, it was 2000. Well, I have these law professors saying 2000 was the worst resolution ever. If only they'd done it like 1876. And I say, no, that's crazy. 1876 was a mess. Close enough election. There's no way to make everybody happy with the resolution. That'll happen sometimes. And so, just 2000 in the end, then the U.S. Supreme Court decides it. And this is the kind of criticism it got. This is the former dean of the Law School of Illinois and his brother. They're both law professors. They write a lot. And it had a very snarky article, extremely unhappy with the Bush v. Gore decision. Said in all the closely contested presidential elections prior to Bush v. Gore, say 1800, 1801, this is the election year and then the year that the inauguration takes place, 1824, 1825, 1876, 1887, Congress, not the court, decide the matter, and rightly so. The Supreme Court should not be thrusting itself into these electoral college contests. And the worst part about the Bush v. Gore decision, it was partisan in the ugliest imaginable way. So there's a sampling of the kind of people who said that Bush v. Gore was what was wrong with the resolution of 2000 was the Supreme Court shouldn't be doing it. Congress should do it. It's the wrong actor. So let me talk about 1876 since that's one of their counterexamples. 1876 was also.
Can I ask a quick question, Brian?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, what exactly did the Supreme Court do in 2000?
I'll give you the short version of that. The certification. Florida law set a certification deadline, and so as the final canvass, the tabulation vote had Bush ahead by hundreds of votes. But then there were a lot of issues about how they were counted and whether there should be recounts. They hit the deadline by Florida law. The Republican Secretary of State said, this is the deadline. There's no more time for recounting. Bush has won. The Florida Supreme Court said, not so fast. We're overruling you on this. Keep going with the recounts. Then the U.S. Supreme Court, with passage of board days, said, Florida Supreme Court, clarify what you're doing here. And the Florida Supreme Court did clarify it, but the inauguration day is rapidly approaching. The U.S. Supreme Court essentially said the recount has to stop. So you can find somebody who's got a tabulation that says, in the end, Gore should have won. The official media recount concluded that Bush actually would have won if they'd done the recount the way they were doing it. But there's not really one answer because the recount itself had so many different dimensions. My conclusion is it's incredibly hard, basically impossible to remedy a count like this in a way that's always going to satisfy everybody, that everybody can agree is objectively fair.
Okay, back to your
way back. So 1876, the Amar brothers, these law professors and others think it was a mess. 2000 wasn't resolved the right way. The Supreme Court shouldn't have jumped in. So what happens in 1876? This is a book, Fraud of the Century. The title suggests to you that they weren't happy with the way it resolved. The contest is described as bitter, the most ethically sordid, legally questionable. Here's a county level map. Blue is Democrat, red is Republican. The South is pretty blue. The North and Midwest are pretty red. But Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana have patches of red, pretty big patches of red. This is basically the part of the country where there are lots of African Americans living. In South Carolina, very heavy, big former slave population, but the Civil War is over. They're not slaves anymore. They're free and they have the right to vote. So what happens, and this is now just, never mind the counties, look at the states. That's where they're the electoral college district. Hayes wins this, the Republican, with not a majority, not even a plurality of the popular vote. He's behind Tilden by a few percentage points. But he gets the electors from Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And So that gives him a margin of one electoral vote, 185 to 184, close as it can get. But what was actually happening in those southern states, basically it's a case of choose your poison. There were two kinds of very objectionable behavior. So there was lots of vote suppression. The Union Army is still trying to manage the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. The Union Army is not a partisan organization, but essentially the Northerners, as the county map showed, the Northerners are largely Republicans. The locals are essentially Democrats. The local white Southerners want the Democratic Party in charge. They don't want any more voting by these African Americans. They're trying to prevent that. Lots and lots of, I said earlier, there was a bloody mess. It was literally a bloody mess. There was lots of violence. People were killed. There were lynchings in suppressing the vote. Suppression both ways, Northern soldiers suppressing the vote of white Southerners, but local gangs of violent white Southerners in probably a larger measure, suppressing the vote of black, enfranchised American citizens, not slaves anymore, but preventing them from voting. So what happens after that is then in the tabulation stage, and most of these states have Republican canvassing boards or Republicans in charge of counting. When they count, they throw out some dodgy votes that are fraudulent, and there's probably a lot of fraud on both sides, but somehow they throw out a lot more Democratic than Republican votes. So they end up saying that although the initial counts make it look like Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina might have been won by the Democrats, in fact, they were won by the Republicans. There's a different story for each of these states about how this plays out. But and the details are kind of interesting, but if I just gloss over them, in the end, there are two slates of electors sent from all those states. Somebody certifies the Democrats and say they won. Somebody certifies the Republicans and says they won. And this gets sent to the Congress, and it's the Congress's problem now. It's not their fault, it's their problem. They have to figure out which of these electors do we count. The electors meet and vote. Usually that's not controversial. It's clear who won the state, and the electors, if the Republicans won, the Republican electors vote. If the Democrats won, the Democratic electors vote. But there were two sets of electors saying, yes, Florida's electors have voted for Hayes. Nope, Florida's electors have voted for Tilden. So they had an argument about Oregon as well, and that also had to be resolved by Congress. So thinking about 2000 again, and those law professors saying the Supreme Court's not supposed to resolve these things, Congress is supposed to resolve them. What did Congress look like? The Republicans controlled the Senate, the Democrats controlled the House. It doesn't sound like it'll be easy to resolve. Both the House and Senate voted on what to do, and not surprisingly, it was straight party votes. The Republican-controlled Senate said Hayes won. The Democratic-controlled House said Tilden won. They had committees formed. The minority members in the Senate, the minority Democrats said Tilden won. In the House, the minority Republicans said Hayes won. Straight party vote. You might think that the somehow along statesman-like resolution of how do we balance off this vote suppression against this fraudulent tabulation. They're both problematic, but can we pick? Everything was straight party. They decided the way they'd solve this is bring the Supreme Court in, not acting alone as a Supreme Court with a Supreme Court case, but they did 5 Supreme Court justices. They make a 15-member commission, 5 from the Senate, 5 from the House, balanced party composition, and they'd get 5 Supreme Court justices. And the reason this seemed like it might be the secret sauce for fixing this was there was one Supreme Court justice who was widely regarded as an independent. He'd been appointed by Lincoln, but the Republicans didn't like him very much, didn't think he was really a Republican. His name is David Davis. So everybody can agree that we'll take what's going to be a 15-member commission with 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, but this one guy that maybe is really independent. And then screwing everything up, the Illinois Democratic Party, the Democratic state legislature elects him to the Senate. While they're trying to fix the presidential election, he finds out that he's been elected to the Senate from Illinois, and he recuses himself, says, if I'm a senator, then I can't be a Supreme Court member in this commission. So that means his replacement is a Republican, and then everything else that happens, there's a lot of hearings, there's a lot of voting, lots of separate votes. Everything is a straight party vote, 8-7. Republicans always say, yep, the Republicans won. So the Republicans get all those states. They resolve the Oregon electorate in favor of the Republicans, saying there was a vacancy. And it would be hard to say that this is somehow objectively better than 2000, that it was somehow less partisan. It was straight party politics. It was monumentally consequential because this isn't really part of the deal formally, but what happened after that was it was the end of Reconstruction. Essentially, the Northern troops pulled out of the South, so we can't keep occupying the South like this anyway. This is not Hayes himself. This is one of his allies, and it's a passage from a letter writing to some Southerners saying that we desire to say we can assure you in the strongest possible manner our great desire to have him, this is President Hayes, adopt a policy that will give the white people of the states of South Carolina and Louisiana the right to control their own affairs in their own way. I added the word white. The word white wasn't there, but it was understood that's what they meant. So the House gets out of the way and says, we'll let this Republican win. We're not happy about this mess. But the Reconstruction has to end. The Southerners have to take control of the South again. They do. It becomes a one-party region, totally owned by the Democrats. And those African Americans who are electing members of Congress and senators, there's some black members in the 1860s and 1870s, they don't get any votes anymore. They don't get to vote for about 90 years till the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So maybe that would have happened anyway. Historians kind of disagree about whether the 1876 election was the only path to the end of Reconstruction. It was going to be hard to keep running the South as sort of an occupying force, but 1876 definitely was the catalyst as it really played out. So that was the end of the little brief window of equality for blacks who had been slaves, former slaves who'd been freed and enfranchised. They lose the enfranchisement pretty fast. And what's the lesson for modern elections? Well, as bad as 2000 was, it wasn't we didn't see gangs of violent vote suppressors all through the South or anywhere else in the country. For those who said it was terrible to have the Supreme Court step in and say the Florida Supreme Court can't have the last word. The recounting is too messy. It's not orderly. Let's just stop it. I don't think 1876 shows you a better way. 1876 shows you can try to get a nonpartisan or a bipartisan agreement on how to make tough decisions about an election that's so close that it's really hard to say who won. But partisanship probably is going to win out in the end. It's going to play out as a partisan decision, and that's what happened.
And all of that you described happened in how long? It seems like it could have gone for like a year, but it has to happen fast.
It had to happen fast with the technology of the day too. They weren't checking their phones every minute to see what was happening in Oregon. There was just telegraph. But the time pressure on getting a president in office is a real consideration. It's been there all along, and they got it done, and the country sailed on. I think that if you said, "Boy, that doesn't sound very good," and I'm not happy with the end of Reconstruction, that's something to lament. But it took a long time before we really saw something like equal voting rights again in the South. So I don't want to minimize the importance of that. But the country got through it. It wasn't, just after a horrible, bloody civil war. This didn't kick off a new civil war. It kicked off a lot of unhappiness, but the country kept going. And then there were very close elections in the 1880s, including another one with the popular vote loser winning the election by getting more electoral college votes. And mostly they were just accepted. That's how the system works, and on we go.
So if the 2024 election ends up being on this list as a contested election, what is the most likely mechanism by which that plays out? Is that possible to speculate?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's not a tie. And I think if it went to the House, first of all, we don't know who would win if it goes to the House. The House that would decide, the U.S. House, would be the new House, the House that's elected in 2024 concurrently with the presidential election. Yeah. Right now, it looks like it'll be a very close call on who's going to control the House. Might be the Democrats, might be the Republicans. But it isn't control of the House that matters. It's control of the state delegations. So if you control more of the states, since the voting is by state, probably Republicans would be in control of the House. So probably if it goes to the House, Trump will win. I think that's not the most likely unsatisfactory resolution. Not that Trump wins, but that it's decided by the House instead of, by the original vote of the people. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest mess will be if it's so close that it comes down to one state, like 2000, like Florida. 1876 came down to one state. If any of those states had been given to Tilden, we would have had a President Tilden, which we never did. So if it's so close that in the end everybody's saying, well, it's all in North Carolina. Who won North Carolina? That's all we have to know. Or who won Arizona? And it takes a while to resolve that. Then people will be furious. There will be lots of conspiracy theories. There will be lots of unhappiness about the election having been stolen. I'm hoping whoever wins, it's not by one state. If it's a case where either Trump or Harris could have won, but you have to flip 2 or 3 states, then maybe it won't be as acrimonious and there won't be as much of a sense that the election was stolen. A grounds for pessimism on this is that it's taking longer to get the vote tabulation done. It's partly an indirect COVID kickoff. Because of COVID and the fear of voting in person, almost every state made it easier to vote remotely. You can have a remote voting system and still say the votes have to be in by the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, what we now call Election Day. But mostly they've allowed ballots to come in a window around that date that might be up to a week later. If it's close and you know that there's a bunch of votes that haven't come in yet, the ballots that are outstanding, then you can't call it. The longer it takes to call, even if it's explicable and people can read the law and understand why, the more people get antsy and think this is being stolen, it's cooked, it's being rigged.
You've got model with the polling that you most trust, have run some models, and I'm not going to ask you to say which candidate for the president is more likely to win, but just because you can say if you want. But can you tell me in how many of the scenarios would it be possibly one state? Is that something that you can pull out of your modeling? Like, how likely is it to have one of these uncomfortable resolutions?
Yeah, I can't give you a probability in that. I probably should be able to, or I could if I went back and played around with the simulations enough. I haven't really looked for it, even though I just said I'm worried about it. I probably should. But part of what I've been emphasizing when I'm talking about forecasting is the polls are probably the best forecast we've got. There's no getting out of the uncertainty. That the polls are crude measurement of a thing that changes. Is pretty volatile. The reason that we don't know who's going to win in part is there are a bunch of people out there who still don't know how they're going to vote. They don't like either candidate that much. Some of them are going to stay home. Some are going to, in the end, go to the booth and hold their nose and think, yeah, I guess I'm going with X.
Yeah, it's a bubbling cauldron.
There are people who have elephants and donkeys tattooed to their chests. They knew who they were going to vote for before they knew the nominees. Their vote's easy to call.
Right.
Lots of them. But there are all the other people out there who they don't like politics very much. They might not vote. They might, if somebody reminds them on election day, they'll go, and otherwise they won't. When they get in there, they'll make a snap decision, and it's really hard to predict behavior like that. This advent of
I've already got
remote voting. Sorry,
I've already got a billion questions, but maybe we're going to have that for the next podcast if you want to get through your content. It's up to you.
Yeah, I don't need to get through all the content. My lesson number one probably is don't take any of the polls that seriously. Treat the margins of error as bigger than their reported ones. And then if it looks like it's really close and you can add it up and get a tie and add it up and get one candidate winning or the other, it's probably just too close to call. You don't be obsessed with thinking you can predict it in advance. Sometimes you can't predict it in advance. All right, one more story, which is about I'll go back to my list of elections that were the winner was not the popular vote winner. This was, I think, was literally from Wikipedia, 1820, 1476. 1888, this is one where it wasn't a lot of controversy. Then we have the well-known Bush score, and then Donald Trump pulls off the same trick. And 1960 is not on this list. Why do I have 1960 possibly added? The key thing is one of the key stories is going to be Alabama. And I've been saying, I think I started out by saying, we talk about voting like I'm going to vote for Trump, I'm going to vote for Harris, but you're not really, you're voting for electors, the electors who will vote for Trump or Harris. So in many states, over many of these elections, in fact, people did vote for the electors. There's sometimes the ballot gave them a list of electors, sometimes it gave them just the option with the name of the candidate, and when you cast your vote for Kennedy, you're really voting for a slate of Kennedy electors. So what 1960, I'll tell you this story about Alabama, and then maybe I'll talk about Illinois, and then maybe we'll have used all the time we possibly can. This was a really close election. The states that were within a 1% margin, where it includes some really big states, Dewey could have won it. Election night, he was believed to have won it when they did all the counting. In fact, Truman won. But ominously for the Democrats, there's this wing of Southern Democrats who are not happy with the party. So you get to 1960, the Alabama primary, and there are 35 candidates for 11 slots. Alabama has 11 electoral votes. There are going to be 11 electors. The Democratic electors might be free or independent electors, and what that means is they're free to pick whoever they want to. They're not going to stand by the party's national candidate if the national candidate is obnoxious, and obnoxious to them means someone who might bring in civil rights law. And there are 11 loyalists who say, if it's a northerner, we're with the northerner. We're loyal Democrats. We're a national party. The ballot doesn't show who's who, so you have to know, if you're following politics closely, it looks like a disadvantage for these free guys. They didn't settle on 11 candidates. They're 24. They're shooting for 11 slots. The vote's going to splinter. But it's a close election, and in the end, they get 6 of the slots, and the loyalists get 5. So this is what the ballot looked like. And when you went to vote, you weren't voting Kennedy or Nixon. You were voting elector by elector. If you wanted to vote for 5 Democrats and 6 Prohibition candidates, or 1 Prohibition and 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, you vote away. You get to pick the electors. It's a so-called long ballot. And what happens then, if you look at the way the votes are usually recorded, the Democrats all got more votes than Republicans. These are the guys who like segregation. These are the guys who are, at least local terms, liberals, who are happy to have a Northern Democrat in the presidency, and they'll take their chances on a Voting Rights Act. They all beat the Republicans, but there's a range of votes here, and these guys who are free are not shy about saying they're not going to back Kennedy. When Kennedy's eventually the nominee, they're not going to back him, and they don't. If we're going to add up the popular vote and insist on talking who the popular vote winner was, usually things are reported like this. Kennedy gets 324,000 votes. He gets 5 electoral votes. Harry Flood Byrd, senator from Virginia, got no votes, but he got 6 electoral votes. If you think that, you think, oh, that must be those faithless electors, those guys who are breaking their pledges. But it wasn't that at all. From the primary onwards, these were guys who said, Alabama Democrats, we don't want Kennedy or any Northerner. We want a Southerner. Let's make sure we get a good Southerner in the office. They, even after it was clear Kennedy had won the election, they didn't vote for him, and they lobbied the other Southern Democrats to say, this is our last chance. Don't let Kennedy in. Join us and vote for Byrd, and let's force the Democratic Party to put somebody else in the president's in the White House. So if you just correct for this and say this is a better way to report the vote, that Byrd got a bunch of those votes, Kennedy got a chunk, Nixon got the others. Nixon didn't get the electoral votes because this is a partition that created by the primary. There was no way for a segregationist type to get all 11 slots. There was no way for the loyal type to get all 11 slots. Then Nixon won the popular vote. He got a little bit more, not by much, but Kennedy won the presidency. It wasn't very close in electoral votes. So if you were bothered that Al Gore was robbed because he won more votes than Bush, you should be bothered that Nixon was robbed because he won more votes than Kennedy. That's part of the story of 1960, and there's a picture of how close it was, and the closest state was actually Hawaii. Down here was like Florida in 2000. It was so close that it was flipped on recounts. Nobody knows who won Hawaii, but Hawaii wasn't that important. Illinois was the second closest state, and Illinois has another interesting story. It was very close. The Cook County, which is the county Chicago was in, and famous for a political machine run at the time by Mayor Daley, results came in quite late, after the other results were in. So it looked like they waited till they knew how many votes they needed for Kennedy to win, and they produced just that many votes. The Chicago Tribune in 1961 said, once an election has been stolen in Cook County, it stays stolen. But there was lots of circumstantial evidence that maybe things were amiss. There, it turns out, was one recount. The Republican candidate for state's attorney in Cook County lost by less than 1%. It just looks just about 1%. It's Benjamin Adamowski here. So he paid for a recount in the city of Chicago, and this was just where paper ballots were used. They couldn't do a recount on the machines. Some of the precincts, they were voting on paper, and they had a stack of paper ballots. And the others, there was a machine, looked like a one-armed bandit. You pulled down a lever, and you record your votes. There's no recounting to be done on those. You read the machine totals at the end, and they're done. So they did a recount, and the first thing that the Cook County board did is they slow-walked it. So it's going to take us several months to get this done, but we'll do it. They didn't want it to be done before the presidential inauguration. But a judge said, no, put as many people on the job as you have to get this done in December. It should be done before the presidential election. So this picture is a card. These are the cards that belong to the lawyer who represented Adamowski. He made all notes by hand and then had his staff type them up, and then they wrote down what happened in the initial count and how many votes were lost or gained. So JFK here in the initial count in this particular ward had 277 votes. They recounted and he was down. He lost 2. He was to 275. Nixon was recorded as 182. When they recounted it as actually 184, so he gained 2. So it's +4 for Nixon. Adamowski in this case lost 2 compared to Ward, and there's another race here. I have these cards because the person who has them was the author of this book, a historian, Edmund Kalina. He wrote a book, and he got the cards from the lawyer from Adamowski. I asked him if he could share his data with me, and he said, here, take the cards. I'm never going to work on this again. So I should put them in an archive somewhere. They're from 1960. The Cook County Board of Elections never released the official recount results. But they just said, well, neither race was overturned. If you want to know who really won Cook County, you have to figure out we have revised returns in the paper ballot precincts. It's in only a small subset, it's about 800 of them, 863. Nixon gains about 1,000 votes there. Adamowski gained a lot more, 6,000. It looks like the Daily Machine had it in for Adamowski. They really made sure that when they made mistakes counting, all the mistakes went the same way, and they helped the Democrat. But if you try to write down some very simple model to impute how much fraud, you could think of it as just error. It's probably fraudulent error. It's tabulation the mistakes weren't random, was likely to take place in machine ballot precincts, and extrapolate and get a number. It comes out so that it's about the right number to flip the result, make it a Nixon win, not a Kennedy win. Kalina himself, who did this analysis and got those cards in the first place, said there's no final resolution of the controversy. In the official canvass, Kennedy carried Illinois by 8,858. That's about what Nixon got, but nobody can say who really carried it. And I think that's a fair conclusion. On the other hand, he thought Adamowski was definitely robbed, that it was at least 30,000 votes that he was robbed of, and that's more than the margin. But I think the story of 1960, part of it was Nixon didn't push as hard as he might have. His allies pushed very hard in Illinois, but Illinois alone wasn't going to give him the race. Hawaii was so close that another recount in Hawaii might have given him Hawaii back. But those two alone wouldn't have made it. That you needed Missouri before he would have won it. There was a lot of speculation that Texas was stolen, that Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's running mate, had a history of stealing elections in Texas, and he made sure Texas was stolen. But there was very little evidence to point to that. In the end, the Republicans didn't really have a case to make, with 3 states having to flip. So Nixon conceded. Privately, he said Kennedy had stolen it, but mostly he said they'd stolen Illinois, and probably was right, but it's hard to prove that. And in some respects, the Electoral College sort of insulates from, even if it was stolen, it wasn't sufficient to change the result. If it had gone to the House, the new House that had been elected in 1960 was mostly states with Democratic majorities. So 3 states had ties. They probably would have abstained. 30 states had Democratic majorities. That includes those deep southern states like Alabama, where there are quite a lot of people who didn't really like Kennedy and didn't want a northerner. But 30 was probably a safe enough margin that I think Kennedy would still have won if it had gone to the House. But we didn't get to see that because the Illinois recount in the end was just wasn't even officially declared as a recount of the presidency. It's just that because that lawyer took the notes that we know something about how much fraud seems to have taken place there.
Tom, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good. I'm hanging in there.
Okay, good. I saw you yawning. That's not a reflection.
No. I was shocked.
It's midnight in Switzerland.
Oh, yes, we're cutting you some slack there, Tom. I'm actually really liking this. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. I want to ask you a question about artificial intelligence, but I can't think of an intelligent question.
I think once you know the history, you think the country's made it through a lot of messes. And when I'm often a naysayer when people say, we've never seen a country so polarized, I say, oh, we certainly have. And I just tell stories about the 1860s and the 1850s. And
I hope we get to talk to you again, Brian. I know you're super busy.
I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. It's the Trump campaign. I got to take the call.
Take it if you have to.
Yeah. Well, it's my daughter, so I probably do have to. So.
Okay. All right. Well,
we can come back to this.
We can come back to this. We should come back to this. And I've got all kinds of other stuff.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
No, I've enjoyed it.
You're officially a Caustic Rebel. and you were harder to get online than Conor McGregor.
Yeah, you can believe that.
All right. Happy to be a cross-stitch rebel.
So I guess you got good night.
Good. Take care. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Tune in next time, dear listener, as your dynamic duo tackle other daunting questions with other guests. Stay tuned for our upcoming 3-part series with Conor McGregor.
Well, a wrecking ball is swinging, ringside bells are ringing.